Hello, and welcome to the Philosopher's Compass podcast. This is a new podcast about finding meaning and purpose through life philosophy, and this is our very first episode. So thank you for joining in. Today, my guest is Brittany Polat. She is the author of Stoic Ethics, The Basics with Christopher Gill. Her Substack is Stoicism for Humans, and she is organizing Stoicon, the major Stoic event of the year for many of us. It's coming up in October, and it's focused on a theme of engaged citizenship. So thank you so much for joining me, Brittany.
Thank you, Meredith, for having me. I'm really excited about your new podcast and honored to be the first guest.
Appreciate that. So I wanted to begin at the very beginning, which is, how did you get interested in philosophy?
Well, I've always been kind of a philosophical person, but in high school, when I started thinking, what is philosophy? Maybe that's something I'd like to get into. I found a book. I think it was like just a brief history of philosophy or something like that. And after reading the book, I determined that philosophy was not for me. I mean, it started with, the pre-Socratics and went all the way through postmodernism. And by the end, I was like, oh, geez, this stuff is not interesting. I didn't care what Wittgenstein was saying. And, I was like, it's pretty remote from anything I would be interested in doing with my life. But fast forward, 15 years or so, and I found myself at a crossroads in my life. I had gone on to study applied linguistics, but I had kind of left that after starting my family. We had moved to a new town. I didn't know anyone. I was, a young mother at home without any real support. And I was just questioning some of my life choices. I was like, okay, well, my career didn't work out the way I thought. What am I going to do with my own life? How am I going to teach my kids to have a good life? And, I started kind of grasping at straws. I was looking around at different self-help books. I looked into Buddhism, as a lot of people do, just trying to find a path for my life. And nothing really clicked until one day I went on Amazon and I just typed in books on wisdom. And, thank you, algorithm. Thank you, Amazon algorithm. One of the books that came up was William Irvin's book, A Guide to the Good Life, The Ancient Art of Stoic Joy. And like many people, I was intrigued. I thought, what is this Stoic joy? That sounds like an oxymoron. So I checked it out and, of course, loved it. Just a lot of things about Stoicism made sense to me and kept on reading, kept getting more and more into it, started writing about it. I had my first blog on parenting, A Parent Stoic, and I read a lot of your blog posts early on too, Meredith, at the Stoic Mom. And, just the more I got into it, the more of a difference it made in my life. And so that was my reintroduction to practical philosophy and also Stoicism, because of course, Stoicism is a very practical philosophy, a way of life.
That's such an interesting journey, and it does have echoes to my journey too, where it was kind of a search for meaning and a search for how to live well that I started, well over 10 years ago. That around that time is what kind of it led me to Stoicism as well. But what was it about Stoicism that specifically interested you?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would have to say virtue. Of course, a lot of people get into it through the dichotomy of control, and obviously that's useful. We all need ways of managing the stresses of life, all those things that are outside of our control. The dichotomy of control is incredibly useful, and you can start applying it almost immediately and see almost immediate results. But for me, it's more about the big picture of virtue, of orienting yourself in the world. We live in a world that's very materialistic, obviously, very oriented around worldly success. So material acquisition, but also the acquisition of career status, for example, or other types of social status, Instagram pictures. Are you going on a vacation where you can look great on Instagram,
Right, right.
So these kinds of things obviously are not the path to long-lasting happiness and fulfillment. And particularly when you're caring for the next generation. So Stoicism, I think it gives everybody a path. It's not just, there are some philosophies like Aristotelianism that are great if you have social position and money and you don't have to worry about losing it or anything like that. But as we all know, life doesn't always turn out that way for a lot of us. And we have to deal with the difficult parts of life. We have to deal with the unexpected losses or the unexpected events that we just have to scramble and deal with. So Stoicism, I think, speaks to everybody because it says, hey, you don't need that thing that you thought you had to have a good life. You don't need it. You can be happy without it. You have this other thing instead, which is yourself, your character, your ability to handle things wisely, and your own personal integrity and virtue. And you can live a good life with just those things. So I think that larger picture is what really appealed to me.
Yeah, you mentioned virtue as one of the key concepts. And I'd love to hear about how you use this idea of virtue in your everyday life and what virtue means to you. How do you interpret virtue in a Stoic sense, and how do you use it in your life?
Yeah, that's a great question because it can seem rather abstract at some level. So for me, I look at nature. So virtue for the Stoics is the same as living in accordance with nature, which is about using our human gifts, our rationality, and our sociability to, live a fulfilling human life, be the best human you can be. Okay, it sounds a little bit cheesy, but basically that's what living in agreement with nature or being virtuous is. It's about using your intelligence, your rationality, your gift of compassion and love, and your ability to think beyond yourself, beyond your own ego, and consider, the larger group or the world as a whole, the cosmos and nature, this kind of thing. So for me, this is what virtue means. It's living in agreement with nature and using the best of our human capacities to share our gifts with others. So let me think, everyday life. Um, well, just to give one example from today, so it's top of my mind. A couple of days ago, I had received an email from someone who I've, corresponded with briefly in the Stoic community, but not a lot. And this person requested that I read a paper they had written on Stoicism. Okay, great. I read it. It was fine. I gave the person encouragement. Well, a few days later, the person wrote to me saying, okay, well, here's an unrelated prompt I'd like you to respond to on AI. And I was like, okay, well, I'm sorry, I don't have time to respond right now. I've got a lot of stuff on my plate. And the person wrote me an email this morning, a really angry email
Wow.
saying, why are you so dismissive of my email? And I was like, okay, well, this is a time when I'm going to be stoic. What does it mean for me to be virtuous in dealing with a person like this?
Hmm.
So I got out my Marcus Aurelius Meditations 2.1 and just reminded myself that people, they think they're doing the right thing for them, but they're not aware of where their benefit truly lies, in being a good person and overcoming the egotistical impulses. So I think virtue means understanding others. It means interacting with others in a way that maybe they're not thinking about. So you have to think for them. You have to think about the bigger picture for them, for you, and for, for your society, I think. So that's just one small example of how I try to use virtue in everyday life. Obviously, I'm not perfect. Obviously, I make mistakes like everybody, but that's what I use to orient myself.
Yeah, that's an interesting example too. I think we all encounter people who are separated from their reason and virtue, and kind of we have to cope with that as real human beings in the living in the real world. So while, as you said, sometimes these concepts seem abstract, in fact, it's very, very important for everyday life. I mean, one thing I love about the Stoic virtues is you really can use them as guideposts in almost any situation. And what I like to do is ask myself, is this brave? Is this fair? Is this the wise thing to do? Do I know enough of the facts and the evidence to make a choice? Am I kind of exhibiting self-control and temperance, which is especially hard in a world where we are not given any really good examples of self-control and temperance, for example. I mean, that's something that on the international and national stage is Very much at a minimum right now. And I think people feel almost emboldened to act with less virtue than in my recent memory. So I think it's kind of I view it as a hopeful act and as an important act to still use these virtues as a guidepost to ask myself, is this choice and is this behavior the right thing to do? Even though I know not everyone will do that, sort of trying to do it and trying to be a role model for it in the process, I guess. But at least, at the end of the day, I know I can feel I did my best to develop my character and be the kind of person I want to be.
Yeah, I love that. And not losing hope. One of my friends, one of our friends, I really like what she said, that you don't have to look at the celebrities or the famous people, the politicians, whoever. You don't have to look to them for your role models. You can look at just the people around you. And surely there are some people. We know not everyone is going to be a model of virtue. But, like Marcus Aurelius, he looked around the people that he had close to him and he found good things in their character that he could admire about many of the people around him. Not everybody, but even people that we know from the historical record who were far from perfect, like his adoptive brother.
Yeah.
Marcus still found something to praise in him.
Yeah, that's a great point because I think one thing I love about Marcus Aurelius's meditations is it is so very personal and it does bring it down to the level of real life. I mean, like they said, Socrates brought philosophy down to the real world, as opposed to just living up in the clouds in the sky. I think it's important to use these concepts to live well, no matter what the circumstance. And so that will be dealing with the people who are around us, dealing with people who can be somewhat difficult. And I think towards us, and as you said, they think that they feel that they're in the right in most of these cases. But in
Mhm.
fact, I mean, I think it's hard because we'll never really have an objective understanding of the entire world. There's no, kind of super, we're not going to become this omniscient being. So we always have to work with the information that we have. But I think using this kind of mindset around the virtues and around developing our character is a way to actually evolve into better people and experience growth. And I mean, would you say you've experienced personal growth through practicing Stoicism?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I don't know where I would be without Stoicism. I honestly, looking back at my life, I don't know. I don't know what that would have looked like, but I'm very happy that I have come this way. Yeah, I mean, every day, as Seneca says, every hour brings something that we have need of philosophy for.
Yeah.
Whether it's dealing with the kids and trying to be a good parent and set them on a good path, or whether you get cut off in traffic, or whether you're dealing with somebody at work, whatever it is, there's always something that we need stoicism or philosophy. I don't insist that everyone become a stoic. I don't think everyone has to agree about everything in order for the world to be good. I'm very happy to talk about other types of philosophies with people. And I know you're very interested in this as well, Meredith, but I feel like there is a common core to a lot of the most treasured and valued philosophies in the world. And that is, compassion, it's kindness towards others, it's getting over your own ego, this kind of thing. So pretty much everywhere in the world where you look and you find a wisdom tradition, that's going to be in it.
Mm, really interesting. Yeah, I've wondered about this convergence of wisdom traditions too.
Mhm.
Thought about that quite a bit, and I'd like to learn more. Well, what do you think about other ancient philosophies? Have you studied any of them? And is there something there that really interests you?
Yeah, well, I think when we tend to think of ancient philosophies in the Western world, we're thinking about ancient Greece. I find myself really interested in ancient philosophies from the East, so particularly Confucianism and Buddhism. Everybody's somewhat familiar with Buddhism. I think there's a lot of understanding about some of the convergence and crossover between Stoicism and Buddhism, the non-attachment idea, this kind of thing, the letting go. For me, it's actually more interesting to think about Confucianism because Confucianism, it gets kind of a bad rap as very focused on ritual, and it is. I'm not saying it's not, but there's also at the heart of it, it's about overcoming yourself and learning how to get along with others in society and social harmony and this kind of thing. So I think there's a lot in Stoicism that overlaps with Confucianism, and it's really fascinating to me how they come from such different parts of the world, but come to, like I said before, come to very similar conclusions.
That is fascinating. I took a course in college that focused on uh, Eastern philosophies and did delve into Confucianism a little bit. Do you have any texts that you'd recommend or any ways of learning about Confucianism that might be of interest to folks?
Yeah, well, one of my favorite scholars is Philip Ivanhoe. So he's very scholarly, but also very, accessible. So
Hmm.
anything by Ivanhoe is great. Brian Van Norden is another really well-known, respected, and also accessible writer. So I
Mm-hmm.
would say find a book by either of those two, and I think they've both written some introductions. Yeah, so Van Norden or Ivanhoe.
Mm-hmm. Very cool. And another question I had about kind of ancient philosophy, clearly it was developed in a very, very different time and place than we live in today, even though we go back and we look at, oh, wow, it was very chaotic. It was, just we think of our times as chaotic, but in many ways, it's nothing compared to that. Um, and I wondered if you could share thoughts on, as modern people, what we tend to misunderstand about ancient philosophy and Stoicism in particular.
Yeah, a great question. And I think one of the biggest things is, of course, Stoicism today has this reputation for being about detaching yourself from other people, not caring about others. And I think part of the reason for that is because in the context of the ancient world, everybody already took it for granted that you're going to care for other people. So they didn't spend
Mhm.
a lot of time saying that, okay, well, yes, you have to care for other people, while you're
Hmm.
also, saying when you kiss your wife and child, tomorrow you might die. So today we're left with the writing that says from Epictetus, it says, when you kiss your wife or child, whisper to yourself, tomorrow you might die. And it seems all macabre and like you're supposed to not care about other people. But what people don't realize is that in the ancient context, it was just so taken for granted that you do love your wife and child. There was no question of this means you're not going to love your wife and child. So I think you're absolutely right to point out that there's a lot of that ancient context that we're not getting when we read the text today.
Yeah. Do you feel that that's related to kind of the modern, or at least the modern Western sense of individualism and, this idea that we can be this you know, rugged individualists and somehow not need anybody. And I think this is also sometimes you see this a lot in some of the American narrative about life, like going out there and just doing it on your own. Do you feel that that's part of the contrast that you're seeing between, ancient Stoic ways of thinking about people and community and what we see today?
Yeah, I do think that's part of it. I mean, also just our modern lifestyle where
Hmm.
we actually physically can live in isolation today. You can have a laptop-based job, you can sit inside, order stuff on Uber Eats all day, have Amazon deliver all your needs, and never talk to another person if you want to.
Yeah.
Well, that lifestyle wasn't really that possible in the past. I mean, you might have had a few lonely shepherds up on the mountaintop, but they weren't sitting in a dark room all the time. They were out in the elements, connected with nature, dependent on the weather cycles, on the grass growing and the sheep having babies. They weren't completely just in an isolation chamber. So I
Yeah.
think that our modern lifestyle actually contributes a lot to our ability to to separate ourselves from others. A lot of us live in big houses, we have separate rooms. If you don't want to see another person in your family, you can stay in separate rooms all day, right?
Yes.
And a long time ago, most people were crammed into tiny dwellings and just didn't have the choice to be by themselves ever, really. So,
Yeah.
I think the course of history has just contributed to pulling us apart, as well as, our this kind of myth of that we, are so great that we don't need anybody else.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's a really interesting perspective in terms of the history of it. And as a historian by training myself, I think that we really do lose sight of how different our lives are in so many ways, and that a lot of what we've chosen to do as a society does go against community and kind of family cohesion, ability to really relate to those around us, or I mean, and people spend so much time going online and debating with nameless, faceless, entities that might just be bots. I don't know, for all we know. And I do think that it creates a situation where people don't relate with each other in as effective ways, and really aren't forced to. Like you said, they can kind of just go isolate themselves, and this is more and more of an issue. And we see a huge epidemic of loneliness. Um, I'm really interested in the way you bring compassion into your thinking and your philosophy and community building. By the way, I also want to mention, I know you're a community organizer. I mean, you've brought people together to talk about philosophy, to share ideas, to give webinars and learnings to others, to organize Stoicon. I mean, I'd love to hear what you think about that approach that you've taken and how it maybe is one of the many antidotes we're looking for to loneliness and separation.
Yeah, well, thank you. I don't know that I have a specific approach. I'm certainly, I mean, there's a lot more things that I could be doing that I would love to do in that area. But just, I think coming together around a common cause is important. Again, because we all, not all of us, but there's this ethos in the culture that, you just go your own way, you do your own thing. And there's also the idea that to be authentic, you don't listen to anybody else. So I've written
Ah.
about this before as well, where there's, even in psychotherapeutic circles, it's all about looking inside yourself to find your authentic self. Whereas I think what we need to do is look at who we're meant to be as humans and find our authenticity in being the best version of a human, which means, living together in a group. Your most authentic self isn't going to be, I'm sorry to tell you this, but you don't have the most brilliant original idea that no other human has ever had, you just don't. We are human. We're constrained by our biology, by the way we have to live together. And to me, that's a beautiful thing, is to understand that about yourself. Know thyself is one of the founding maxims of Greek philosophy, which I think speaks to that. So this idea that you have to be completely unique and you're brilliant just as you are and you find your authentic self, I think that's actually contributing to some of our loneliness.
Mm. It's also getting to the question around what are we here for? Like, why are we even here?
Yeah.
Um, and one thing I really love about Stoicism, and the deeper I got into it, and the deeper I got into ancient Greek philosophy in general, is this concept of flourishing.
Mm.
So flourishing can be very different from what most modern people would think of as, pursuing happiness. Because most people's idea around happiness, it's more maybe related to the hedonism of the past of like, oh, I love good food. I want to have fun. I want to go on a great vacation. I want to drive a fancy car. But in ancient Greek thought, there was this concept of flourishing. And I wondered if you could share what you think, what's your definition of flourishing and how that relates back to your philosophy and what you've studied.
Yeah, well, going back even to Aristotle, he talked about the telos, right? And so we flourish, or anything, not just humans, but an animal, a plant, anything that exists, I guess. For right now, let's just say anything that's alive flourishes when it's fulfilling its purpose in life. It's telos. What is it meant to do? And that's not something that we actually decide for ourselves as humans. I think that's something that's given to us by nature, by our human nature. So we flourish when we fulfill that nature as rational and sociable. So, it hasn't changed in 2000 years. I don't think it will change as long as we remain human. Perhaps at some point we'll evolve to be something else. I don't know. But as long as we're human, this is our telos, is to live with other people and develop our rationality and our sociability. So I think even in ancient Greek times, this was it was a very common concept in philosophy, but the philosophers were also up against pop culture, if you want to call it that. Most people living their daily lives were not talking in philosophical terms about flourishing. Like people today, they were in the marketplace, buying, selling, trying to get rich, falling in love, trying to get married, crying when they lost their beloved or their heart was broken. So most people were doing the same things that people today are doing. But I think it's the philosophy that has changed. And modern philosophy is not really oriented towards flourishing or happiness or telos. So I think we've lost a lot there.
Right, right. I mean, when most people think of philosophy, they're thinking of probably something more related to maybe Kantianism or utilitarianism or some of these other things that I also had a chance to study some of that in college a bit. And uh, I found it very interesting, but I do not feel that it was kind of the basis for a life philosophy for myself. And when I came to Stoicism and kind of this revival of ancient Greek philosophy, I suddenly saw that there was this path for using philosophy in a very practical way. And some of it has to do with kind of the first principles. Like you mentioned that a flourishing human needs to, embody the best of what a human is, right? Which in the Stoic way of thinking, you mentioned this, it's rational, so a thinking person, someone who can think and determine what's true and what's not. And then sociable, so someone who can be part of their community and in fact part of their world, because the Stoics were very cosmopolitan, like everyone is your sister or brother and we're all in this together. So if you combine those two, it's like a magic potion of how to be a better human. So I just find that very interesting. And when I first came to Stoicism, that wasn't the first thing I learned at all. I definitely learned more about the dichotomy of control. And Stoicism is not about a stiff upper lip, but it's instead about, separating out what we can do with our own agency. And so that was very powerful. But then the deeper I got, the more I saw this flourishing idea made me so much happier. And that leads me to a question I have for you is like, does your philosophy bring you joy?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't think we could say that a philosophy brings you joy, but I think a philosophy can enable you to bring yourself joy. It can enable you to find the joy in your life. So I think your life philosophy is extremely important in what level of joy you might be able to feel in life, but it's not going to do it for you. You know,
Hmm.
and that's the beauty of it. Like Seneca said, our forebears are, the people who came before us and developed these ideas, they are our guides, but it's up to every generation to figure out how to apply it in our own lives. And so I think every person, someone could hand someone all the principles wrapped up in a nice package with a bow on it and say, here you go. This is the secret to life, to a good life, to a happy life. And that person still would not be able to live a good and happy life unless they go through the process of applying them to their own life and figuring out the details in their own life.
Mm. Well, on that note, what do you think would be the first steps that someone should take if they're maybe vaguely familiar with Stoicism or philosophy? What would you recommend someone to take as their first steps in this direction?
I would say get yourself a good routine
Mm.
for learning more, because it's going to be a journey. It's going to be a learning process, and you've got to be prepared to learn at least a little bit every day. So I always tell people, I have a time in the morning when I wake up, I drink my coffee, and I have a space where I will read something about philosophy, or I will write or journal, or just meditate, listen to a meditation, something just to get me in the right mindset, right frame of mind for the day. And through that, that helps me a little bit every day to learn a little bit more. And it's great if you can apply that in the evening too. I'm a morning person, so I have my most energy, my most mental energy in the morning, but some people are opposite. And if you have more mental energy in the evening, then do your main time there, your main meditation session before bed, for example. But establish yourself habits and routines and set yourself up for success is what I would say.
Mm. Yeah. habits and routines are something that I personally don't love, but I always struggle with it because I usually am I love being spontaneous
Mm.
and feeling the freedom of spontaneity, but it's a little tougher for me because I rely on, that spontaneous inspiration to pick up the book or to, do the practice. So I hope in a future iteration of myself to have a few more of these routines be more regular. And I do think it helps. I mean, I think having that even just that spaciousness to be thinking about things and when you devote a block of time, if you can do that, or even if it's a short time, even if it's 15 minutes, it's a way to clear your mind of all the buzz and chatter of our world. Do you feel that practicing Stoicism has given you a greater sense of meaning and purpose in your life? After all, we co-taught a class about meaning and purpose using Stoicism recently, and that was an amazing experience. And I feel that that's part of the conversation I'd really like to bring to the forefront, and that's why I'm doing this podcast. Like, has this brought a sense of meaning or purpose, or however you define those terms?
Yeah, yeah. I'm so glad you're doing that because I think that's something so many of us are looking for today. And I would say absolutely, Stoicism has really helped me to define my purpose. When going back to 2016, when I first picked up my first book on Stoicism, I really felt like, you know, I felt worthless basically because I had left what society told me I needed to value. I had left behind the way to be a valuable person, which was, a career, accomplishments or achievements or traveling, living a cosmopolitan, not in the stoic sense, but traveling and jet setting and all of this. And I had left all of that behind, and I felt that I was, I had no status in the world. I had no when people said, "Oh, what do you do?" and I couldn't say, "Oh, well, I'm a professor," then I was like, "Okay, who am I?" So Stoicism helped me to completely redefine who I am and what I want out of my life. And yeah, I've never looked back.
Mm. Would you be willing to share a little bit more about that redefinition, that sense of purpose and your vision for it?
Yeah, well, one thing that we did in our course that we co-taught is we encouraged people to develop their actual statement, their life's purpose statement,
Mm.
in just a very succinct few words. And I think this can be challenging for people because, there's so much we want to do, so much that we think matters. But I love this idea of just really focusing on a few words. So one of my most important words is seeker, which, I'm definitely not alone in that. But for me, that was important to make that recognition because I think we have a lot of pressure to have, final answers about everything. And it's about accomplishments, it's about adding things to your CV or your resume. And by saying, okay, well, I'm a seeker. I'm looking. That is what I do. I'm curious about things. I want to learn more. I want to discover. I continue to push forward, so that enabled me to leave behind all the expectations of you have to accomplish this, you have to do XYZ by age XYZ, and instead allow myself the space to just say, yeah, you know what? This is who I am. This is part of what I do. This is what makes me happy is learning and seeking about beauty, virtue, justice, all of these things that we look for in Stoicism. So for me, that was very, very helpful.
That's awesome. And you're not only a seeker, but you also share what you've sought out and learned in your process and helping all the other seekers like me in the world to learn something. And I really, really enjoyed your book, Stoic Ethics, The Basics. I just thought that book really helped shed a lot of light for me. So I recommend it to everyone. And I think that we can all work on these purpose statements. In fact, they're a living thing as well. They're going to evolve, and maybe it gets to the core of us. But as we go forward, we can sort of bring out more pieces of ourselves through this process of seeking and understanding who we are and who we want to be. And well, thank you so much, Brittany, for joining me and for having this conversation. It was fantastic to talk with you.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me. It was an amazing conversation, and I look forward to many more on your podcast.
Thanks, Brittany.